My name is John, and up until that night I thought I had a good life, or at least that's what I told myself. My wife, Sarah, and I were the picture-perfect couple on the outside. She had the kind of beauty that turned heads at every party, and I took pride in being the man by her side. People envied us, and their admiration fed into the illusion we both cultivated. But beneath the polished surface, there was something deeply wrong. Sarah had a way of cutting me down without ever raising her voice. Her remarks were sharp, cloaked in humor, always teetering on the edge of insult. "Oh, John, you're such a pushover." She'd laugh in front of our friends, dismissing my feelings as though they were nothing. I shrugged it off. After all, wasn't marriage about compromise? About making things work no matter what? It wasn't until my brother Mike invited us to his housewarming party that I began to see the cracks I'd been ignoring. Mike and I had always had a complicated relationship. He was the charming one, the risk-taker, the guy who could walk into a room and own it. I envied him in ways I didn't want to admit, but I never thought he'd betray me in the way he did. Sarah was excited about the party, more excited than I'd seen her in months. She spent hours getting ready, choosing a dress that clung to her body in ways that made my stomach churn with unease. "Do I look good enough for Mike's fancy friends?" she teased, twirling in front of the mirror. I forced a smile, ignoring the knot tightening in my chest. As we drove to Mike's house that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I chalked it up to my insecurities, the little voice in my head that always told me I wasn't enough. Not for Sarah, not for anyone. Little did I know, that night would rip my life apart. Mike's house was everything I expected, spacious, modern, and just ostentatious enough to remind everyone he was doing better than them. The guests were a mix of his colleagues, old friends, and strangers whose laughter filled the air, amplified by glasses of expensive wine. Sarah seemed to glow in this setting, like she belonged there more than she ever belonged in the quiet life I tried to build with her. The evening started innocently enough. Mike greeted us with his signature grin, slapping me on the back while pulling Sarah into a hug that lingered just a second too long. "John, you lucky bastard," he said, his eyes darting to Sarah in a way that made my stomach twist. "How did you manage to snag someone like her?" I laughed it off, as I always did, pretending his words didn't hit their mark. But Sarah didn't laugh. She smiled, a coy, knowing smile, and leaned into him slightly, as though the compliment was meant to be savored. As the night wore on, I began to notice the way Mike's attention fixated on Sarah. He refilled her glass before it was empty, leaned in too close when she spoke, and laughed a little too hard at her jokes. What unnerved me more was how Sarah responded. She wasn't just enjoying the attention. She was encouraging it. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was imagining things, letting my insecurities paint a picture that wasn't there. But then came the moment I couldn't ignore. We were gathered in the living room, a circle of people trading jokes and stories. Mike, already a few drinks in, decided it was time to turn the spotlight on me. "You know, Sarah," he began, his voice dripping with mockery, "John's always been a bit of a pushover, hasn't he?" The room erupted in laughter, but I didn't join in. I felt the blood drain from my face as I glanced at Sarah, silently begging her to defend me. But instead, she smirked and said, "Oh, absolutely. That's why I married him." The laughter grew louder, but I barely heard it. Mike wasn't done. "So what does that make him? A cuckold?" he said, grinning like he'd just won a game I didn't know we were playing. For a moment, the room went silent, as if everyone was waiting for Sarah's reaction. She looked at Mike, then at me, and shrugged. "Well, if the shoe fits," she said, her voice light but her words cutting deeper than I thought possible. I stood there, frozen, as the laughter swirled around me like a storm. My face burned with shame and anger, but all I could do was turn and walk away. I left the party without a word, ignoring Sarah's voice calling after me. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, replaying the scene over and over in my mind. The betrayal wasn't just in Mike's words or Sarah's indifference. It was in the realization that this wasn't a new wound. It had been festering for years, hidden beneath layers of denial and excuses. By the time I reached home, I knew there was no going back. The drive back felt like it stretched for hours, though in reality, Mike's house was only 15 minutes away. I couldn't bring myself to turn on the radio. The silence felt suffocating but also necessary. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Rage, humiliation, and an aching sense of betrayal that sat heavy in my chest. When I reached home, I parked the car in the driveway and just sat there, staring at the steering wheel. The house loomed in front of me, dark and quiet, but it didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a prison I'd willingly walked into, brick by brick, blind to the bars forming around me. I stepped inside and turned on the light, the empty living room greeting me with an eerie stillness. The memories hit me like a wave. Sarah and I laughing on the couch, sharing dinner at the table, her smile that used to feel like warmth. Now, those moments felt like lies, carefully constructed to keep me blind to the truth. I poured myself a drink, something stronger than usual, and sat at the kitchen table. The glass trembled in my hand as I replayed the events of the evening. Mike's smug grin, the laughter of the crowd, Sarah's cold indifference. Her words echoed in my mind. Well, if the shoe fits. I slammed the glass down on the table, the sound shattering the quiet. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the edge, trying to steady myself. How had it come to this? How had I allowed myself to become the punchline of someone else's joke? The night stretched on as I sat in that chair, my mind unraveling the web of lies and manipulation that had defined my marriage. I thought about the subtle ways Sarah had chipped away at me over the years. The offhand comments, the dismissive looks, the way she always seemed to side with others when I needed her most. I felt like a fool. But more than that, I felt angry. Angry at Mike for his cruelty, at Sarah for her betrayal, and at myself for letting it happen. By the time the sun began to rise, the anger had hardened into something sharper. Resolve. I couldn't keep living like this, pretending everything was fine while I suffocated under the weight of her disdain. I needed to take control of my life, to reclaim the dignity I'd let slip through my fingers. I pulled out my laptop and began researching divorce lawyers. The words felt foreign as I typed them, but also liberating. This was the first step, the first move in a battle I hadn't realized I'd been avoiding. Then I made a list, practical things like gathering her belongings, finding a storage unit, and drafting a letter to explain everything. I wanted her gone before she had a chance to manipulate me into staying. When I finally closed my laptop, the house was bathed in the pale light of dawn. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of clarity. The life I had built with Sarah was over, and though it terrified me, I knew it was the only way forward. The day ahead would be difficult, but I was ready. The morning light painted the house in muted tones, but it felt hollow, as though the warmth had drained out of it long ago. I hadn't slept a minute, yet I felt more awake than I had in years. The decision was made, and there was no turning back. I started with the practicalities. Sarah's things were scattered throughout the house. A pair of earrings on the bathroom counter, her favorite books on the shelves, clothes spilling out of the closet we shared. As I moved through the house, gathering her belongings, each item felt like a ghost of the life we once shared. I found the first anniversary gift I'd given her, a gold necklace with a small pendant. She used to wear it all the time, but I hadn't seen it in years. It sat at the bottom of a jewelry box, tangled with other forgotten pieces. The sight of it twisted something inside me. Had it ever meant anything to her? Her favorite perfume was still sitting on the dresser. I picked it up and opened the bottle, the scent flooding my senses. It brought back memories of evenings spent together, her laughter echoing through the house. But now, even the scent felt tainted, like a cruel reminder of how blind I'd been. By noon, I had packed everything into boxes. Her clothes, her books, her trinkets, everything that felt like hers. I stacked them neatly in the corner of the living room, ready to be taken away. The house looked emptier, but it also felt lighter. Next came the letter. I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and paper, staring at the blank page. How do you condense years of betrayal, heartbreak, and resolve into a few sentences? I started and stopped a dozen times, the words feeling either too harsh or too weak. Finally, I wrote, Sarah, last night was the final straw. For years, I've ignored the cracks in our marriage, excused your behavior, and told myself things would get better. But I can't do it anymore. What happened at Mike's party made it clear that there's no respect left between us. Not from you, and after last night, not from me either. Your things are packed. I've contacted a lawyer, and the divorce papers are ready. Don't try to talk me out of this. It's over. I hope you find whatever it is you've been looking for, but it won't be here. John. I folded the letter and placed it on top of the boxes. My hands were steady as I did it, but my chest felt heavy. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about letting go of the man I'd been, the man who let this happen to him. By evening, everything was ready. I called a storage company to arrange for the boxes to be moved the next day. I didn't want Sarah in the house for longer than necessary. As the sun set, I sat in the now empty living room, the silence pressing down on me. For the first time in years, it felt like my house, mine, not ours. And though it was painful, there was also a sense of relief in that. Tomorrow she would come home. Tomorrow I would say the words out loud. And tomorrow my life would change forever. The morning came heavy with anticipation. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as if bracing itself for what was about to unfold. I paced the living room, checking the boxes stacked neatly in the corner, rehearsing what I would say when Sarah walked through the door. By noon, I heard the familiar sound of her car pulling into the driveway. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. I sat down on the couch, deliberately positioning myself in full view of the front door. There would be no hiding from this. The door opened, and Sarah walked in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She was smiling, but the moment her eyes met mine, her expression shifted. She noticed the boxes almost immediately. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice sharp, a hint of nervousness creeping in. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I motioned for her to sit down. She hesitated, her eyes darting between me and the boxes, before finally perching on the edge of the armchair. "I've been thinking about last night," I began, my voice steady but low, "about everything that happened at Mike's party, and everything that's been happening between us for years." She crossed her arms, leaning back slightly. "Oh, come on, John. Don't tell me you're still upset about that stupid joke Mike made. You're overreacting." Her dismissal stung, but I refused to let her derail me. "This isn't just about last night," I said, meeting her gaze. "It's about the way you've treated me, Sarah. The disrespect, the manipulation, the way you've made me feel like I'm never enough. Last night just made it impossible to ignore anymore." She rolled her eyes. "So what? You're gonna throw a tantrum because your feelings got hurt? Grow up, John." Her words were like gasoline on a fire. I stood up, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "This isn't a tantrum, Sarah. This is me standing up for myself, for the first time in years. I've already contacted a lawyer. The divorce papers are ready." Her face fell, the color draining from her cheeks. "You're not serious," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I gestured toward the boxes. "Your things are packed. I've arranged for them to be moved to a storage unit. You have until the end of the day to figure out where you're going next." For a moment, she said nothing. Then her expression hardened. "You're really doing this?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "Throwing away everything we've built?" "What we've built," I repeated, my voice rising. "Sarah, what have we built? A marriage where I'm the butt of your jokes? Where my own brother feels comfortable humiliating me in front of a crowd because you've let him think I'm weak? That's not a marriage. It's a lie." Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time I saw a flicker of vulnerability. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice shaking. "You're going to regret this." "Maybe I will," I said, stepping back toward the door. "But I'd rather regret leaving than spend another day regretting staying." She stared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line, as if searching for something to say that would change my mind. But I didn't give her the chance. I walked out of the room and left her to face the emptiness she had created. As I stood in the driveway, the cold January air biting at my skin, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. For the first time in years, I had taken control of my life. Inside, I heard the sound of her footsteps and the rustle of her things as she prepared to leave. The weight I had carried for so long was beginning to lift. Tomorrow would be the start of something new. The house felt eerily quiet after Sarah left, like a vacuum had sucked the life out of it. I sat on the couch, staring at the spot where she had been just hours ago. The confrontation had drained me, but it also brought an unfamiliar sense of relief. A strange, bittersweet freedom. I spent the rest of the day in silence, letting the gravity of my decisions settle in. Her boxes were gone now, taken to a storage unit. The letter I'd written was no longer on the table. She had stuffed it into her bag before storming out. It felt final, yet surreal, like I had stepped out of my life and into someone else's. As the hours passed, the reality of being alone began to creep in. I wandered through the house, noticing the spaces Sarah had left behind. The bare counter in the bathroom, the empty side of the closet, the absence of her voice. For so long, her presence had filled every corner of my life, even when it was toxic. Now, without her, it felt like I was standing in a hollow shell of what my life had been. I wasn't sure how to feel. Sadness wasn't the right word. It was more like mourning. Mourning the man I'd been and the years I'd wasted trying to make a broken marriage work. I poured myself a drink and stepped outside onto the porch. The winter air was sharp, biting at my face, but I welcomed it. I needed the clarity, the grounding feeling of cold reality. As I stared out at the quiet suburban street, I thought about what lay ahead. What would my friends say? What would my family think? Would Mike see this as a victory? Another notch in his belt of conquests? The thought made my jaw clench. But then I reminded myself, this wasn't about them. It was about me, about reclaiming my life and rebuilding it on my terms. Later that night, I sat down with my laptop to write an email to my lawyer, confirming that I was ready to move forward with the divorce. Typing the words felt like a strange kind of therapy, a tangible step toward something new. Before bed, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of vacations, holidays, quiet moments with Sarah that seemed so genuine at the time. I almost deleted them all but stopped myself. Those moments were real, even if they were overshadowed by what came after. They were a part of my story, and I wasn't ready to erase them just yet. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the quiet became less oppressive and more peaceful. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, I felt like I had a say in it. I fell asleep with a strange mix of emotions: grief, hope, and a growing sense of determination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and new doubts, but I was ready to face them. The following days passed in a blur. The house was emptier now, and I found myself filling the silence with whatever I could. Music, the hum of the television, even the steady rhythm of the washing machine. Yet, no matter how much noise I created, the echoes of the past lingered. I went back to work, trying to throw myself into tasks and meetings, but even there, I couldn't escape. Colleagues who had met Sarah at company events asked after her, their questions stabbing at wounds I wasn't ready to expose. I gave polite, vague answers, keeping the truth locked away. One evening, as I sifted through a stack of unopened mail, I came across an envelope addressed in Sarah's handwriting. My heart sank. I debated whether to open it or toss it aside, but curiosity won. Inside was a letter. The tone was different from the Sarah I had come to know, less cold, more reflective. John, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from right now, but I needed to say this. I didn't think you'd actually go through with it. When you said you were done, I thought it was just another argument, something we'd fight over and then move past. I didn't think you'd leave. I don't know how to explain why I did the things I did. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was resentment. Maybe it was something broken in me that I didn't know how to fix. But I know this. I pushed you away, and you finally had enough. I don't blame you for leaving. I just hope you know that I wasn't always this person. There were times when I loved you, really loved you, and I'm sorry I lost sight of that. Sarah. I read the letter twice, then a third time. Her words stirred something in me. A mix of anger, sadness, and a glimmer of the hope I used to cling to, but I quickly crushed it. The apology was too little, too late. It didn't undo the years of hurt or the humiliation of that night at Mike's party. Still, her words haunted me. I started to second-guess myself, replaying moments from our marriage and wondering if I'd missed something, if there had been signs that could have saved us. But then I'd remember her smirk, her indifference, and Mike's laughter echoing in my ears. One night, I made the mistake of looking at her social media. Her account was still public, and I scrolled through posts filled with carefully curated moments that painted a picture of someone unbothered. Pictures with friends, smiling selfies, and even a post from the night of the party, captioned, "Some nights are unforgettable." The bitterness in my chest swelled. While I was here, sifting through the wreckage of our marriage, she was out there, carrying on as if nothing had happened. I closed the app and tossed my phone aside. Staring at the ceiling, I made a silent vow to myself. I wouldn't let her live rent-free in my head anymore. The next morning, I packed away the few remaining reminders of her. A framed photo on the mantel, a sweater she'd left on the back of a chair, a cookbook we never used. I put them in a box and shoved it into the back of a closet, out of sight and out of mind. This was my life now, and I was determined to take it back. Sarah had become a ghost, a lingering presence that I needed to exorcise. But letting go is never simple, and the weight of the past has a way of clinging to you, no matter how hard you try to shake it. The days began to stretch into weeks, and the raw edges of my anger started to dull. The bitterness that had consumed me began to fade, leaving behind something quieter, a deep, aching emptiness. But even in the hollow spaces of my life, there were small sparks of hope. I started running in the mornings. At first, it was just an excuse to escape the house, to outrun the memories that haunted its walls. But as I pushed myself mile after mile, the physical exhaustion became a kind of therapy. Each pounding step on the pavement felt like a release, a way to let go of the weight I'd been carrying for so long. One morning, I took a different route and stumbled upon a small coffee shop I'd never noticed before. Its warm, inviting glow stood out against the gray winter morning. On a whim, I went inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods wrapping around me like a comforting embrace. The barista, a woman with kind eyes and a bright smile, greeted me as if we were old friends. Her name tag read Emma. There was something refreshing about her presence. No pretense, no hidden agenda. Just a genuine warmth that I hadn't realized I missed. As I sipped my coffee at a corner table, I watched the world go by through the frosted window. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a flicker of peace. The thought crossed my mind that maybe life wouldn't always feel this heavy, that maybe there was room for something better. But hope is fragile, and the shadows of the past have a way of creeping in when you least expect them. Later that day, as I sorted through some old files, I found a folder marked Vacation Plans, 2023. Inside were itineraries, printouts of hotel reservations, and notes in Sarah's handwriting. It was a trip we'd planned together, a dream vacation to Italy that we'd talked about for years but never taken. The sight of her handwriting, so familiar yet now so foreign, hit me like a punch to the gut. I sat there, holding the papers, as a wave of grief washed over me. Not just for Sarah, but for the life I thought we were building together. I spent the rest of the evening in a haze, torn between wanting to forget and feeling like I owed it to myself to remember. Grief is strange like that. It makes you cling to the very thing you're trying to let go of. That night, I returned to the coffee shop. Emma was still there, her smile as bright as ever. I didn't tell her about the folder or the memories it had dredged up, but just being in her presence made the weight feel a little lighter. As I left the shop, the cold air biting at my face, I realized something. Healing isn't a straight line. It's messy and unpredictable, full of moments where you feel like you're making progress only to be pulled back by the tide. But even in the mess, there are glimpses of light, small reminders that life can be more than the pain you've endured. And for the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, those glimpses could turn into something more. The morning started like any other. I laced up my running shoes, the familiar ritual grounding me before I hit the pavement. The streets were quiet, the cold air crisp against my skin. Yet, as I ran, an unfamiliar tension crept in. A nagging feeling that today would bring something unexpected. By mid-afternoon, the knock on the door confirmed it. I froze, staring at the sound as if willing it to go away. When it came again, more insistent this time, I forced myself to answer. Standing on the porch was Sarah. She looked different, not in appearance but in demeanor. Her confident posture was gone, replaced by something hesitant, almost uncertain. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything unspoken hung between us like a fog. "Can I come in?" she finally asked, her voice soft. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to say no. But against my better judgment, I stepped aside, letting her into the house that was no longer hers. She glanced around, her eyes lingering on the spaces she used to fill. "It's strange being back," she said, her voice tinged with melancholy. I crossed my arms, keeping a safe distance. "What do you want, Sarah?" She turned to face me, her expression a mixture of guilt and determination. "I needed to see you, to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. Her eyes flashed with something. Anger, maybe, or frustration. "Don't do that. Don't shut me out like this." I let out a bitter laugh. "Shut you out? Sarah, you shut me out for years. You humiliated me. You let my own brother mock me in front of a room full of people. And now you think you can just show up and talk." She flinched, but she didn't back down. "I made mistakes," she admitted. "Big ones. But I've been doing a lot of thinking, and You what?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You're sorry? You want another chance? Do you have any idea what you put me through?" Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I do," she said quietly. "And I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed to tell you that I see it now. I see how selfish I was, how much I hurt you. I can't change what I did, but I can tell you that it wasn't because I didn't care." Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. For the first time, I saw a glimpse of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But it wasn't enough. "Sarah," I said, my voice softening despite myself, "I appreciate that you're here, that you're trying, but it doesn't change anything. I've moved on, or at least I'm trying to, and I think you need to do the same." She nodded slowly, as if she'd expected my response but still hoped for something different. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I needed you to know." I walked her to the door, the finality of it sinking in with each step. As she turned to leave, she hesitated, looking back at me one last time. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm sorry, John. Truly." I nodded, but I didn't respond. Words felt meaningless in that moment. As I watched her walk away, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. Anger, sadness, relief. They all swirled together, leaving me drained but oddly at peace. I closed the door and leaned against it, the house once again silent. For the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. Felt like closure. And for the first time, I believed I could truly begin to let go. The weeks that followed were a blur. I threw myself into work, the same way I had when I was avoiding the truth in my marriage. But this time, there was a difference. I wasn't avoiding my life. I was building it from scratch, piece by piece. The house was quieter now, the absence of Sarah's presence almost peaceful. But it also left space I wasn't sure how to fill. I started picking up old hobbies again, things I had put on the back burner over the years. I went back to painting, a passion I had abandoned after meeting Sarah. Each stroke of the brush was like reclaiming a part of myself that I had forgotten. Emma, the barista I had met at the coffee shop, became a familiar face in my routine. We started talking more, casual conversations that slowly turned into something more. She didn't rush me, didn't pressure me into talking about my past or opening up before I was ready. Her patience felt like a breath of fresh air, and I found myself looking forward to those small moments when we shared the same space. One afternoon, I found myself sitting at the counter of the coffee shop, sipping on a cappuccino. Emma sat across from me, her smile easy and unforced. We were talking about the books we'd been reading, but I found my gaze drifting to her, not to the conversation itself. There was something comforting in her presence, something that made me feel like I was allowed to hope again. "You know," she said casually, her eyes meeting mine, "you don't have to keep running from your past." I froze, the words catching me off guard. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, the lightness in her voice betraying the depth of what she was saying. "I don't mean you should dive back into it, but you can't keep ignoring it either. There's a balance, you know? You have to find peace with it if you want to move forward." Her words stayed with me long after I left the coffee shop. The idea of peace with the past seemed so foreign, something I had never truly considered. In all the chaos and pain, I had been so focused on pushing forward that I hadn't thought about finding closure. And that's when it hit me. True healing wouldn't come from just leaving Sarah behind. It would come from accepting that part of my life, however painful, and choosing to move forward without carrying that weight. A few days later, I sat down and wrote a letter to Sarah. It wasn't about rekindling anything. It was about releasing the last fragments of anger and disappointment I had been holding on to. It was about closure. "Sarah, I've spent a lot of time thinking about everything that's happened. I'm not going to say it was easy, because it wasn't, but I think I'm finally at a point where I can say I'm done. Done with the past, done with the hurt, done with everything that came before. I'm moving forward, and while I can never forget what happened, I'm choosing to let go. I hope you find your own peace, the same way I'm searching for mine. John." I didn't expect a response, and truthfully, I didn't need one. Sending that letter felt like I had closed a door, one that had been open for far too long. Over time, I noticed subtle changes in myself. I slept better. I smiled more. I started to feel alive again, in a way I hadn't in years. And as the months passed, I found myself reaching out to people I had neglected during the darker days of my marriage. I reconnected with old friends, joined a community group at church, and even began dating casually. Through all of it, Emma was still there, a quiet presence in the background, someone who reminded me that it was okay to start over. We didn't rush anything. There was no pressure, no expectation. It was simply two people getting to know each other, and for the first time in a long time I was okay with that. One evening, I found myself sitting on the porch, staring up at the stars. I realized how far I had come. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared completely, but it no longer defined me. It was part of my story, but it wasn't all of it. I had a future to look forward to, one that was mine to create. I wasn't sure what it held, but for the first time in a long time I wasn't afraid to find out. Months had passed since Sarah and I had parted ways, and though life had continued, something inside of me had quietly shifted. I wasn't the same man who had once stood in that living room, feeling betrayed and broken. But the journey to this point hadn't been without its challenges. The days felt different now. I wasn't constantly haunted by the echoes of the past or the shadow of my failed marriage. There was a lightness to my life, like I had been carrying around a weight I didn't even realize I was dragging behind me. Slowly, without realizing it, I had started to forgive. Not just Sarah, but myself. Emma and I had grown closer over time. We weren't rushing into anything, but there was something genuine there, something real. Her quiet understanding of my journey, her willingness to let me take my time, had given me the space to heal. I didn't know what would come of it, but for the first time I wasn't afraid to let myself be vulnerable. One evening, as we sat on the porch together, she asked me, "Do you ever think about what you want for the future? What comes next?" I sat back, feeling the cool breeze against my skin, and thought about it. "I think about it more than I used to," I admitted. "I used to live in the past, in the what-ifs. But now I'm just living. I'm building something new." She smiled, her eyes soft and patient. "And what does that look like for you?" I thought about it for a moment before replying, "I'm learning to trust again. To trust myself, to trust life, and maybe, just maybe, to trust someone else." It wasn't the most profound answer, but it felt true. Life had a way of moving on, of pushing you forward whether you were ready or not. And despite all the pain I had endured, despite the betrayal and loss, I was starting to understand that life wasn't about staying stuck in the past. It was about the future, about the person I was becoming. The next few weeks brought more clarity. I started making plans for the future, not just for myself, but with the people who mattered to me. I had friends who had stuck by me, even when I had been lost in the fog of my marriage. They were my support system, and I had been blind to their loyalty in the past. Emma and I continued our slow, steady connection. We talked about our hopes, our dreams, and our fears. There were moments when I wondered if this was the start of something lasting, but I wasn't in a rush to find out. For the first time, I was content with where I was. I had no need to define it, no need to put pressure on myself. And one day, while driving home from work, I realized something. I wasn't looking over my shoulder anymore. I wasn't worrying about Sarah or the broken pieces of my past. I was focused on the road ahead, on the possibilities of the future. It wasn't perfect. There were still days when the past tried to creep in, when old wounds throbbed and doubt threatened to overshadow the progress I'd made. But in those moments, I reminded myself, healing doesn't happen overnight. It's a long, winding road, full of bumps and detours, but the destination is worth it. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to meet it. Sometimes the hardest thing we can do is let go of the past, especially when it's full of pain and regret. But the truth is, we can't build a better future while we're still holding on to what's behind us. It's easy to get caught in the idea that the best part of your life is behind you, but that's a lie we tell ourselves to stay comfortable in the pain. The truth is, life is constantly evolving, and we have the power to shape what comes next. To anyone reading this, if you've been through something similar, whether it's betrayal, loss, or heartbreak, I want you to know that healing is possible. It takes time, takes courage, but most of all, it takes letting go of what you can't change and choosing to move forward. If you've found something in this story that resonates with you, or if you've been through your own journey of rebuilding, leave a comment. Let's share our stories. And if you want to be part of this journey, hit that subscribe button. You never know what comes next, but together, we can face whatever the future holds.